to give us the opportunity to be with you in heaven and to be with you in eternity. The love that is beyond our comprehension, but for which we are so very grateful. And we ask that study be pleasing in your sight, that it be scripturally sound, that it strengthen us, and that it enable and encourage us to take your word out to the world, because we know that without your word in people's lives, their souls will be lost. And we ask that you strengthen us and guide us so that we can reach out and guide more souls to you through the gospel. We ask that you be with those who are traveling on the road and keep them safe. We're so thankful that we are home safe, and we're so thankful that Mike and Karen have made it home, and that 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 so many people who have been on the road for the holiday seasons are back. We ask that you continue to guide and protect those who are traveling, and we know that this evening, on New Year's Eve and on New Year's Day, there will be a great deal of potentially dangerous activity going on, and we ask that you protect those who are not only on the roads trying to travel, but those who might be doing things that are foolish. Keep them safe, and be with where they are, and our first responders, because it's probably going to be a busy night. And protect them. We ask that you be with all of us. We ask that in us and strengthen us through your gospel. Encourage us through the work that we do for each other. We ask that you continue that you grow this church, that you give us the strength and courage to go out and do those things which are necessary to grow this church, because we know that it will not grow in and of itself. We know that we are charged with expanding the borders of your kingdom, and we ask that you give us the encouragement and the strength to do so. We offer this prayer in the name of your precious Son. Amen. So we're wrapping up. We're wrapping up Esther, and of course, chapter 8 was where Haman's evil plot was basically. Chapter 7, it was exposed, and in chapter 8 we see that Mordecai was allowed to craft a law which would. And remember, the problem we had was you couldn't just strike down a law, because the laws, there's an immutability factor that's going on. The principle that once a law is passed by a king, that another subsequent king cannot strike that law down. That was a Medo-Persian thing. Okay, and so as a result of that law was passed, and I note that apparently this law was kind of passed behind the king's back. The king fell into it. He gave Haman his ring. Okay. And he fell into what I consider to be Hamadatha's plan to basically take over the kingdom. And so when he did so, Haman used the king's authority to draft a law which would take revenge on the entire Jewish race for the sake of getting back at one man, that man being Mordecai. Okay, now that's hard. That is a harsh thing, and we see it happen, but we don't see it happen to this extent anymore. But once that law was passed, they had to find a way to get around it, and the way they got around it was to preempt that retribution, which was going to be exacted primarily by Haman and his family and their friends, wherever they were, the influence that they had all over the country. And apparently that family, Hamadatha's family, was pretty influential and pretty widespread, because there seemed to be a great deal of angst against the Jewish people in that throughout the whole kingdom, and we'll get to that here fairly shortly. But we note that the law was written so that the new law was written that said that on that same day they would have the opportunity to defend themselves, to preemptively strike at their enemies. All right. And so that sort of changed things around, and we see that attitudes started to change, and people started to swing more against Haman and Hamadatha, because they were in many cases there were probably over 1.5 million Jews in not counting their family, who had been taken into captivity, plus the new generation that had been born there and raised. Okay, so we're talking probably several million Jews who were living there. That's a pretty formidable force if you allow them to take up arms, and that seems to be what has happened here. Okay, and so we note that there was a great deal of joy and excitement, not just by the Jews, but we also noted that because there were so many other nationalities, remember 127 different provinces, and there were all those nations that not only the Assyrians and the Babylonians had conquered, but those which the Medo-Persians had conquered as well. So this empire stretched from northern Africa all the way up to the Black Sea and across to, and I'm outlining them backwards from northern Africa all the way up to the Black Sea and all the way across down to the coast of India, and even part of eastern India was absorbed by this kingdom. So it was very vast, and there were a lot of peoples who were captives in that land. And because this was a law that was passed to exterminate an entire nationality, they were concerned because if it can happen to them, it can happen to us. And so whenever this law was turned around, not only were the Jews very, very relieved and happy about it, but those who thought, well, they might be next, were very concerned as well. And we've seen what ethnic cleansing can look like in this modern world. And so we see that we discussed that law, and now we're going to talk about how that law played out. I'm going to kind of jump ahead here because I had it on 8, not paying attention to what I was doing. But that should be Esther 9. I apologize for that. But Esther, we're talking about the Jews being vindicated and the founding of the Feast of Purim, which is the only non-religious feast that the Jews that they celebrate, that they observe. Okay, so now we're going to go to chapter 9, verse 1. I'm going to let Pat start reading, and I probably won't have a great deal to say about most of this, but I might try to kind of illuminate it just a little bit. So go ahead, Pat, and read, if you would, please, the first 2 verses. Yeah, and we note, of course, that even the officers and the governors and the satraps and the rulers who had basically remember, he had almost a year to consolidate Mordecai, to consolidate his power and his influence, and so we note that they are aware that the tide has turned against Haman and Hamadatha and all of Haman's family. And so they are basically deserting them in droves at this point. Okay, so they are saying, if we don't want to be considered as an enemy of the Jew on this day, because the Jews have the right to go out and take vengeance upon, to preemptively strike all those whom they perceive as enemies. Okay, so doubtless there were a few probably unscrupulous Jews who used this law to take care of grudges. But we're going to note that there weren't very many, because they had some opportunities that the king had given them that they did not take advantage of, because I would be inclined to think that Mordecai had told them that they must stay their hand, and they must limit it to limit the scope of their counter activity, if you will. So we go to verse 3. And we note, though, that the Jews gathered in the cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. I just outlined how big that empire was. Okay, so they have this day, and they are all gathered together to stand up against those who are perceived as their enemies, and those who had demonstrated their intent originally. And remember, when the first law came out, there were those who were saying, "Oh, you guys are going to get yours." because well, on this particular day, and of course they said there's nowhere to run. Well, there wasn't any place to run. There was nowhere in the province. They couldn't travel far enough to get away from this. Okay, so now we look at the rulers and the provinces, verses 3 and 4, if you would please.
And the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and officers of the king helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout the provinces, for the man of Mordecai waxed greater and greater.
And of course, this man, they say, this man is powerful. He's very powerful. He's got the king's ear, and he's the king's right-hand man. And you don't want to be on his bad side. And so they said, whatever he says goes. And that's what these governors and rule. Well, that's political. That's political. The political realities. If you stand up against someone who is powerful, you end up, it costs you your job. And in many cases here, it could have cost them their lives. Okay, because they would have withstood him. They could not do that. And so you see that they saw the handwriting on the wall, if you will. But also, you have to note that probably Mordecai's very capable administration of the kingdom had made things go better. Okay, remember how Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego had greatly expanded the prosperity of the kingdom. We see that Joseph did the same thing in Egypt. God blessed these men with the ability to make things better, make the place a better place than it was when they got there. Okay, and so Mordecai has apparently done that, and there are a lot of people who are very grateful for the work that Mordecai has done. So it's not just about being afraid of Mordecai, it's also about being appreciative of the things that Mordecai had done. And we'll note also, as we get further on in here, that the king himself appreciates what's going on and appreciates the work that Mordecai has done, because the king could have turned that around had he wanted to. But he relied on Mordecai more and more as time went on. Okay, so let's keep going as we get to. So we see that was his fame, and then we see what happens on the 13th, and that 13th is throughout the whole province, but on the 14th as well in the city of Shushan. All right, verses 5 through let me see, 5 and 6.
Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughtered and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And unto Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men.
So in Shushan the palace, when it says Shushan the palace, it means Shushan the city. Okay, in Shushan and so we're talking about 500 men. Now you think that's a lot, but it's not. I mean, you got to consider how many people were living. There were probably 700,000 people living in this city, and there were only 500 or so that were taken down because of this activity. But that 500 included, and if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and read the names of these in verses 7 through 9, and then I'll turn it back over to you. I'm going to say these are the sons: Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arasai, Aradai, and Vajasatha, which sounds more like an Indian name than, right next to each other anyway. So probably that's why the names are so similar. But these are, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha. And I want to point that out to you, all right, that it was laid that way. So, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil they laid not their hand. Now, if you go back into Esther 8, verse 11, you see that the law gave them the opportunity and gave them the authority to take the spoil of those whose lives they took. So there could have been a lot of profiteering going on. They could have said, well, you know what, I want this vineyard. It's a nice piece of property, so I'm going to drum up a charge against this guy so I can kill him and take his property. There was an opportunity for greed, but the scripture says none of that spoil was taken. That's about the discipline. That's about the hand of God and the discipline of God and the respect that they had for God's law. And so continue as we get to go ahead and continue to read, if you would, please. Read 11 and 12.
On that day, the number of those that were slain in Suscalon, the palace, was brought before the king. And the king said to Esther, the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Suscalon, the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done to the rest of the king's providences? Now, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee, or what request further, and it shall be done.
So it's very interesting that the king has received word, and so he's asking Esther, the queen, what more do you need me to do? He's still interested in rectifying the situation. All right. And he's also probably interested in kind of sticking it to Hamadatha. And I know that, as we said before, I'll just back this up again here. It's laid out the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they. Now, we don't hear what happened to Hamadatha. We don't know whether Hamadatha survived this or not. But I bet he wished he was dead. What if, I mean, how much do we love our grandchildren? And what if you got up one day and they were all gone? They were all dead. You know, I mean, wouldn't you feel a lot like Job did? You know, a lot like Job's wife, who, not being the man of, not being as godly perhaps as Job, said, you know what? You should curse God and die. Okay? So it's terrible tragedy to lose. It's a terrible tragedy to lose anybody, and nobody should. And I don't think any parent wants to outlive their children, but to have all your grandchildren snuffed out like that in front of you, and we're talking about an entire bloodline going away here. All right, so so he sees the end of all of his plans, and remember that everything that belonged to Haman, his son, was now property of Esther the queen and being administered by Mordecai at this point. Okay, so things have turned around for that whole family, and all of the schemes of Haman, which had to have flowed down from Hamadatha, and Hamadatha is undone as well in this thing. Okay, so now we see that she is. What is her response to that? Okay, go ahead.
Then said Esther, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are on Suscalon to do tomorrow, according to the day's decree, that Haman's 10 sons be hung upon the gallows. And the king commanded it to be done so, and the decree was given in Suscalon, and they hung Haman's 10 sons.
So now what he asked, Esther asked for one more day. Now, in all probability, Mordecai asked for one more day to continue in the city of Shushan to make sure that the conspiracy was completely taken out. Now, in the process of doing it, taking out of this, dealing with, I've got you, I'll get you in a second. In the process of dealing with this conspiracy against the Jews, they also dealt with those ambitious men who this conspiracy, this attitude would have given them driven them to conspire against the king himself. Okay, what's your question, Pat?
In 10, it says the sons of Haman, the son of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, slew they. It says that they killed them there. But then again here in 13, he's asking for them to be hung. So did they die twice or what?
No. This was Mordecai's way, probably, and perhaps the king's way of setting an example for everybody. They took the bodies and they hung the bodies up. They were already dead, but they took the bodies and they hung the bodies up. It says on the gallows. Now, according to the Muslims, they stuck them on a spike. Okay, but I'm not sure. It doesn't say that in Scripture, and I don't think that their Bible is accurate enough in that regard. But they hung them up. The point is, they displayed their bodies for everybody to see. This is what happens. This is what happens when you defy. And remember that the king had a law written behind his back. The king was betrayed by Haman. So he was probably pretty willing to go along with this. You know, you mess with the Jews, you mess with me, you mess with me. This is what happens. Okay. Now there might be a little bit more speculation. I'll be speculating a little more here than needs to be done. But the point is that an example was set. And so the king demanded that it be done. But also remember, the job was not completed. And so they were given an extra day, And that was a local, and when you think about that, on the 13th, when this law came into effect, throughout the whole nation, throughout the whole, all the provinces, the Jews basically struck out at their enemies at this point, their declared enemies. But at Esther's request, and probably at Mordecai's request, that job, most of those people had gone to ground and hidden, and that took them longer to find all their enemies. Okay, so, and the king was probably amenable to this because, again, I know conspirators, and one thing the king hates is conspiracies. All right, because if they conspire against one person, they can conspire against me, and if they can hide their activities from me, then I'm in danger. So Mordecai went out and found more. Okay, now they had killed 500 the day before, and on this day, they killed another 300 at Shushan. But remember that once again, it is said the prey. Let me go ahead and put this out there. Did I read that? Did you read that part already?
I read up to 15. I'm going on to 16.
Okay, so let me point out again that once again it is laid out there that the prey, that is the spoils, they laid not their hand. In other words, they didn't take any property from anybody. They didn't take any spoils from anybody. And that kind of harkens back to Jericho, doesn't it? Okay, remember when Achan kept the silver chalice and Ai would not fall, even though they were inferior in forces to the Jews, and the Jews came back with a tail between their legs, and God said there's sin in the house. I think that Mordecai, the hand of God, seen here in the way that the Jews have uniformly stayed their hand as far as property is concerned here. Okay, all right. So continue on, if you would, please.
But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives. And the rest of their enemies slew of their foes 75,000, but they laid not hands on the prey.
Okay, so now let me see if I've got that. And keep going. One more verse.
On the 13th day of the month of Adar, on the 14th day of the same rested day, and made it a day of feasting and gladness.
Okay, so what we see here is that they carried out, and the nation exercised their vengeance only on the 13th and celebrated on the 14th, 15th, and 16th. Okay, in Shushan, they were granted an extra day. So they executed their judgment, the law, on the 13th and the 14th, and then on the 15th, 16th, and 17th. They rested and celebrated with feasting and gladness, as it will say here momentarily. So go ahead.
But the Jews that were in Susquehanna assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 15th day, the same they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness.
And so you see that they had 2 days, and so their day of feasting was actually a day later than the feast and the celebration and observance that was taken in the province. Okay. So next verse 19.
Therefore, the Jews of the village that dwell in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. And
okay, so on the 14th, celebrated, but in Shushan and in that region, that Shushan, that the city around the palace, they celebrated a day later because their work was unfinished. All right. Okay, so now we get to the institution of this feast and how it came about. So go ahead and read, if you would, please.
And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews that were in the provinces of the king of Ahasuerus to establish them among them that they should keep the 14th day of the month and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, in a month from which is turned them from sorrow to joy, from mourning into a good day, and that they should make the day a feast and joy, and sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor.
Okay, so that it was an almsgiving, a gift-giving time of period, a time of reaching out and helping those who are less fortunate than themselves. So it's an observance of their deliverance by delivering other people from their economic poverty, and particularly to those Jews who are less fortunate than they are. So it's kind of a Christmas of a sorts for them, if you will. Okay, and so we see that that day was set, that 14th day of the month of Adar, a 2-day feast, the 14th and the 15th, as it was done. Okay, and so we see that the Jews responded. So go ahead and read, if you would please, read through 25.
And the Jews understood to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hung on the gallows.
Okay, so what we're seeing here is a brief recap, a summary of what had happened, and how Haman had basically been hoisted by his own petard, if you will. Okay, so now continue on, please.
Wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore all the words of this letter, and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon their seed, and upon all that joined themselves unto them, so it should not fail that they would keep these 2 days according to the writing, and according to the year.
Okay, so what we're seeing here is that is just a temporary festival thing, and it's not just something that they will celebrate while they're here, but they will continue to, when it says all their seed, and we're going to see this one more time, that every year, that it's a time appointed every year, and it is a law that is passed, and it is in the records of the Medo-Persians. Okay, so in all probability, this law was written not only, of course, these laws were passed and were written not only in the Hebrew language, but also in all the languages of the province, and including the official language of the court. Okay, so we see that it was written in Akkadian as well. All right, so or Aramaic, as it is called. All right, so on verse 28, please.
Should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed.
Nor the memorial of them to perish from their seed. So you see that this is something that they carried with them, and they celebrate the Feast of Purim to this day. Not only that, but they have 2 Purims. They have a Purim which is a recognition of the deliverance of the day that in the whole nation. Okay, and then they have a Shushan Purim, which is the day when that final retribution, if you will, or that final preemptive action was carried out on that second day, on the 14th day of Adar. So we see that those days this day. All right, so continue.
Then Esther, the queen, the daughter of Abihail, wrote with all authority to confirm the second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of and the words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their terms appointed according to Mordecai the Jew, and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they decreed for themselves and for their seeds the matters of and their cry.
The matter of the fastings and their cry. And so we see that, and continue on, verse 32.
And that these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book.
So not only was this decree sent out by the king, sent out by Mordecai in the king's name, but Esther the queen now somehow has attained the authority to write a letter of affirmation that gets affixed to the document, to Mordecai's decree, to validate to basically affirm the validity of it, the veracity, that it is a law that they need to observe. And so it was written, and when it was written in the book, we're talking about written and recorded in the legal documents of the Medo-Persian Empire. Okay, the Chronicle of the Kings of Media and Persia, as it will be discussed. Now we're down to like three verses here. And actually name it as its own separate chapter, an adjunct, if you will, to this one as it closes out. So, and remember, I have noted before that these chapter breaks and these verse breaks and even the punctuation, which is found in these, was uninspired and was put in by those translators of the versions of the Bible. All right, so just read all of those three verses.
And the king Ezra laid a tribute on the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai unto the king advanced him. And they are not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. For Mordecai the Jew was next to the king of Anizar, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all.
We see that Ahasuerus, it's so much easier to say, but Ahasuerus is the name that is given to him in the Bible. The Greeks called him Xerxes. The Ahasuerus was the name that was given, whether it was a Jewish name or whether it was his official name under the Persian. I can't say that. Here that the king Ahasuerus laid tribute upon the land. Now this is a statement when it says, and this is not an after the fact statement. Okay, this statement could very well read, now the king Ahasuerus laid tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea. Okay, what that means is that the king Ahasuerus, this was the summation of his power and the reach of his authority. He controlled all of the known world at that point, with the exception, of course, of India and North Africa, which, as far as they were concerned, probably didn't really exist. But it attests to the importance of his the kingdom, as it will. And he says, upon the isles of the sea, because actually, even though when they lost to the Greeks, they lost a great deal of control of a great deal of the seaboard and the Mediterranean Sea and the control there, they still controlled Crete and they still controlled Cyprus. Okay? And those were the two major islands in the Western Mediterranean at that time, and they still controlled those because they were able to keep them. Okay? So we see that is the extent of his power, and then we talked about the acts of the power and the might, and how he declared Mordecai. Remember that Mordecai was in his records, and how he had declared Mordecai, how he had elevated Mordecai, gave Mordecai the authority to draft laws in his stead. Okay, and asked if they are not written in the book of the Chronicles of Media and Persia. Now, there are those who try to tell you that the Medes and the Persians were different empires. But the fact that their chronicles were both of Media and Persia were one document is an archaeological after one kingdom. Okay, yes, ma'am.
It says the matters of fasting and their cries. So did they fast like on the 13th and feasted on the 14th and 15th, or what?
Where is that? The matters of
31. It says.
Oh, okay, in 931.
Yeah.
Of the matters of fastings. Remember that this deliverance was preceded by a mourning and fasting. And so they take that whole event, and whenever they celebrate it, they go through this mourning, this fasting period. And I don't know how that fasting entails. It could be a day, it could be 2 days, it could just be a solemn observance at this point. But they go through the fasting phase, and they go through the deliverance phase, and they go through the celebration phase, right, as they basically reenact that whole long event that happened there. And you remember that it took place over the course of an entire year, essentially. Okay, and so they reenact that and compress it down into a 2 or 3 day period of time. And I don't know a great deal about Purim, and maybe the next time more research into that and find out how that's done. But you can see what they do nowadays to celebrate that, how that takes place. But note that it is not a religious festival, so to speak, religious feast or observance in which they participate as a nation, as a people, if you will. Okay. Are there any comments at this time? We note that Mordecai, the Jew, and we had mentioned this before, was next unto the king and great among the Jews. In fact, so great that he was the greatest among the Jews. In fact, he was second to the king, the most powerful man in the entire kingdom. All right. See how God has protected them and how God has used these men. Now, there's some speculation that Mordecai was himself a eunuch. I don't know. He worked in the court. He sat in the court. He sat in the gate of the court. It may very well have been that he was a court official, okay, which might stand. Remember, whenever he put sackcloth on and refused to enter into the court, okay, and Esther was concerned about that because he was basically, in all probability, he was charged with official duties there, and he was refusing to come into the castle, into the palace, if you will, to do that. I say castle, but the palace, onto the king's, basically into the king's property, to do that work. And so that started this whole thing, and how Haman was exposed and then undone. But you see that God had a way, and once again I note that although God's name is not mentioned in this, okay, except for alluded to strongly in that one conversation that Mordecai has with Esther to convince her that she has to go before the king. God's hand is on every word in this book, in the book of Esther. Are there any questions or comments at this time? It's been a good study. I think we'll probably move on into, we have not done Chronicles, but I think I'm going to probably do Chronicles. And we'll note that Chronicles are basically revisiting the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Chronicles may well have been a rehash of 1st and 2nd Samuel, a history compiled, and we don't know when, possibly during the exile, that 1st and 2nd Chronicles was rewritten so that those records could be preserved in the memory of the Jewish people after they had lost their kingdom. Okay, and so we'll start in 1st and 2nd Chronicles next week for our morning study. And note that it is rather extensive, and it will take us a while to get through it in the morning. Are there any other questions or comments? If not, let's go ahead and break, and we'll be back at the top of the hour for our Sunday service. Thank you very much.